Dom and Johnny in the morning. All right, so we have a big one that we've been teasing for a while, and I think it's because last time I made the claim that the 5 animals are undervalued in general in our system. That is a bold claim that was kind of confirmed for me. I kind of asked around about it. But because of that, we had some people ask some questions about the 5 animals and how they relate to Shaolin Kempo Karate. But before we get too far down the rabbit hole, I figured we could start with what the 5 animals are.
Specifically, tiger, crane, leopard, snake, dragon.
Yeah, and how do they relate to the system?
So the way that it's always been explained to me was that there were 5 ways to win. So not just 5 styles of movement, but also 5 different tactical styles.
Yeah.
And then just 5 different ways of living in general. They end up becoming metaphors for a numerous amount of things, both in and outside the martial arts. So it's funny, we tend to use them in so many different ways. So sometimes I think of snake as in being, the snake we teach the students, like reptilian, the style, the kung fu style snake. And other times, in teaching, we talk about snake as being, very direct with the student, in nipping something in the bud quick, But then, sometimes I also think about snake just with where you are in your material and how quickly it can come to the forefront of your mind. So if someone throws a punch and your reaction comes out with zero thought, that's a very reptilian reaction. In that way, I would say, at this point, you've progressed these techniques to a very snake-like point. Not quite dragon, where dragon still reacts without thought, but it also can, very specifically control its actions, to make sure that there's a win-win situation. So we end up using the animals for so many different things.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, I've been told before. Obviously, this opinion is an opinion. Like there are other masters in the style that I'm sure would disagree with this, but the 5 animals are the core competency of the style. In that, you learn karate and kempo mechanics in order to be an effective fighter. But really, when it comes to the infinite possibilities of the art, the 5 animals really are the things that they teach and the way that you can apply them both on the mats and beyond really are kind of the core of everything. I even recently got my hands on this VHS of Fred Villari teaching weapon defense. And he immediately starts with you gotta be the crane, and he's someone's coming in two-handed with a baseball bat, and he's basically doing a crane technique on them. So that being said, we've touched a little bit upon the history of our art, and so a question I have for you is, because Fred Villari, when he talked about Shaolin Kempo Karate, the Shaolin part he often called Chinese temple boxing or Chinese boxing, which is a little different from Kung Fu, especially from my understanding, which again is probably wrong, the Shaolin Temple, where it's not it's more touristy. I was talking to another martial artist recently where it's it doesn't have the same combat weight as a lot of what our masters in our style call Shaolin. It's not quite the same. So where do the 5 animals come from? Do they come more from the traditions of the Shaolin Temple that have kind of gone through some permutations, or can you clear that up at all?
Yeah. So I think Kung Fu and the animal styles, you actually see a lot of influence in animal styles across many different forms of Kung Fu, even outside the Shaolin Temple. There is a lot of haziness between, when the temple was burned down, all a million times.
Right.
And, what monks continued to teach, the original system outside of the temple and what's in the temple now. I know that at the forefront of the Shaolin Temple right now is predominantly wushu, and that's mostly having to do with just the Chinese Communist Party. You know, they don't believe in, you know, training fighters for the most part, you know. But they do believe in tourism, and tourism's really big in China, and the temple is really big point of tourism for China. There is other training areas at the temple that the tourists don't see. But there's an interesting individual named Ranton, and granted, for our young listeners, he's not the most appropriate.
Yeah, so he has some explicit words in some of his videos.
He does.
So viewer discretion is advised.
But he talks about his time, and he spent 3 years there, and being half Chinese, he was, you know, kind of accepted to work out with those guys. And he even points out that sometimes they would do some sanda, and sometimes they would do china.
And what's sanda?
Sanda is like a Chinese kickboxing, except it has throws. It's really, really cool. But he said for the most part, it's wushu. You know, that's what they were doing.
Yeah.
You know? So even with their, you know, quote unquote warrior monks, you know, that trained, you know, away from, you know, public view, they were still training for the most part wushu. But he did, like I said, he did mention that sometimes, you know, an instructor would come down and do like sanda or do china or do some Wing Chun. But anything that is taught inside the Shaolin Temple is technically Shaolin martial arts.
Right.
And that's where things get really hazy. So there's stories that some of the monks escaped, and that's what the Southern Shaolin Temple is now, is like the remnants of that. And from my understanding, they teach something called 5 Elements Fist down there, which is supposed to be a lot closer to what they originally taught. It also looks a lot more like karate, funny enough. And it does look like the closer you get backwards, the more you see the connection to karate, and the farther away you see the connection to wushu, which is pretty neat. So it wasn't that it was necessarily harder, but that when it was brought to the Okinawans, you know, just because of how it looked, I think they perceived it to be harder. And just with their, like we talked about in another podcast, how their culture of, you know, perfection and everything, you know, that I think that's what hardened the style so much. But you always see these animal influences across all these styles. And you end up seeing that bleed into karate too. So that's why you have things like crane in karate, which I think they refer to as heron. Yeah. Because their translation just wasn't right.
Right.
So yeah.
Even in our style, the form statue of the crane that we teach at Greenbelt, that's a karate form. It's like it's got an animal name and animal energy attached to it, but it's not, from what we've been told, one of the Chinese forms. It's Japanese. Yep.
Which actually, that was Rohai.
Yeah.
Which translates to heron.
Yeah.
So we changed it back to crane.
Yeah. Well.
But that's the cool thing. And then even as you progress into like the Hawaiian Kempo styles, maybe not as much Hawaiian Kempo, but as it came down the line, you started seeing, you know, them start to refer to animals. Even Ed Parker's system, which is the American Kempo system, which is a little, you know, it's parallel to ours, but just very different thought process. But they even used the tiger and dragon as prominent pieces of their system and how they explain things, as well as the crane. So crane, tiger, and dragon, you hear that a lot in the American Kempo system. So
yeah, actually, just on that point, our mutual friend Ian, who's a martial artist, sent me a video of a Kempo technique called sweeping tiger. That's basically one combination. But like it's got that kind of like animal name attached to it. Because I think that the imagery can really help like figure out what you're supposed to be doing mechanically. Mm-hmm. As a quick digression, just on the karate Shaolin connection, you can confirm or clarify this. But what I was told is that, you know, if you look at it etymologically, so karate, very Karate Kid, like kata means empty, te means hand, so it's empty hand, as opposed to having a weapon like a katana or something. But originally it was Tote, which meant China hand, except they didn't want to give the credit to the Chinese. So that's why they changed the name to Empty Hand. So, like, even at its inception, there was this kind of Chinese root.
Yeah. That's a whole fun story in itself. And Jesse Enkamp, I always want to lean towards him because he speaks Japanese, but he actually says Todi, even though I used to always hear it as Tote as well.
Yeah.
But if you hear him talk, he always says Todi, and just because he studied in Beijing at university for 4 years and he's fluent in Japanese, I assume he's correct.
Right.
But yeah, China hand, and then they actually, even before the Japanese government kind of took control of that, they had turned it into the hand of whatever region they're in. So in the Naga region, they taught Nagate. In the Tamari region, they taught Tamarite. And then Shirite. So, and you can still see those styles every now and then. You'll see like Shirite or something like that, and you're like, whoa, like that's either old school or someone just renamed it that. You know? And because Gichin Funakoshi, who is credited with creating Shotokan, did not believe in naming the styles. He said it's all karate. He said there's no reason to name it. He was like, there's no difference. He was like, we all teach different functions of it, but it is all karate. And the only reason it was called, his system got called Shotokan, which he hated, was because the place he taught, he referred to as Shotokan. It was his home. He called that place Shotokan, which I forgot what the translation of it is. So then his students started saying, well, I learned Shotokan. Yeah. Much to his dismay. Blew up in his face.
Well, just to circle back to Jesse Enkamp for a second, I think one of the things that's interesting, because we've talked about how just Valaris, if you just look on the general web, not the best reputation. It draws criticism, some of which is unfair, some of which is fair. But one of the things that I saw just from someone who obviously had never really looked at the style is like, the criticism is it looks like someone just put a bunch of SEO terms and smushed them together to sound better, which is interesting because when we talk about Shaolin, even in our school, we clarify it as Chinese temple boxing, which is different than wushu because, like we just talked about, wushu doesn't really have the same like fighting application immediately. Like I'm sure you could get there, but I do think that it's interesting that it's not wrong to call it Shaolin because it comes from the temple, like you said. It's just not very clear. It's a little hazy. And I think a good example is, one of Jesse Enkamp's most popular videos that you showed me was the monkey style. And so one of the things I had heard from my teacher is there was a martial artist in our area that had this really cool monkey form with a bow staff. And he did like a Sun Wukong thing where he planted the staff and like climbed up it and stuff, but there was no application. It looked really cool. It was very aesthetically strong, but you wouldn't fight with it. Yeah. Whereas the video that Jesse Enkamp did, it's a monkey style. This guy trains special forces. So it's not just because it's Shaolin it doesn't work, which I find tends to kind of be the narrative when you're looking in martial arts forums. It's well, if Kung Fu worked, why isn't it an MMA and that kind of stuff? And just because it's an animal style and it has Shaolin roots, it really has to do with how you train it, what you're training for, and who your teacher is and if they're teaching you effectively. So China is another really interesting one. You were on the receiving end of China a few weeks ago.
I was, yeah.
You can probably attest to the fact that even though on the outside it looked like you were just playing along, you weren't.
Nope. I'm not sure what it feels like to have a seizure, but I can only imagine it's something like whatever was happening to me.
Yeah.
Because all the muscles in my neck just cramped up and my eyes were twitching and... Yeah. He just got me in the right spot,
Well, and the reason I brought up China is because a lot of times, from the masters in our style, it gets equated to white tiger, which is an extension of one of the 5 animals, like you mentioned before. So to kind of get into it, The five, so that's like a broad overview of what the five animals are. To get into specifics, you have tiger, crane, leopard, snake, and dragon, like you said before. One of our first questions is, why are there only five? Why aren't there more?
There are.
Yeah.
So the five, I think the reason why we start with the five basic animals is because all those sub-animals tend to be advanced forms or combinations of those five.
Yeah.
So it's like having a color chart and asking, well, why do we only have red, blue, and yellow? Well, it's because green is blue and yellow.
Yeah.
And purple is red and blue. So, injecting different animals into each other creates other sub-animals. And, developing one animal to a very high level creates a sub-animal.
Yeah.
That's at least how it was explained to me, which is my disclaimer I use all the time.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But yeah, so I mean, because you got monkey and eagle.
Well, even white tiger, like I just mentioned, the way it was explained to me, is that just as a tiger gets old and as its fur starts to gray, it has a lot less exuberance than when it was young. So when it comes to a fight, it just ends it quickly. And Chana is the expression of that, where you get a grip on a vital point and you just apply pressure and fight's done. Mm-hmm. So it's efficiency, it's direct, and it ends it so quick. Yeah.
It is interesting how well it runs parallel to the actual animal kingdom when you watch a tiger attacking its prey, and then you watch it just holding down its child, in annoyance.
Right.
And I think that's the chin-out part of it.
Well, and you also said something that I think is key, which is a very advanced concept, but it's also good to be aware of, is oftentimes we talk about the five animals separately because it just makes them easier to talk about. In reality, especially as we get into the life metaphor part, I think one mistake a lot of people make is thinking you're only one of these at a time. When in reality, we're all of them all the time. It's just which one is being emphasized. It happens a little more based on our personality, our backgrounds, the environment we're in. If I'm teaching a class, going to be very different than if I'm hanging out with friends and family. It's also going to be different than if I'm having a hard conversation with a student who's misbehaving. But dragon especially is not one or the other. It's you can be more than one of them at the same time. Great example, our teacher Ken, who we talk about a lot, one of the things he said is whenever he applies tiger, which is the most direct of the animals, he is always also in crane to monitor how it's going so that way he doesn't overstep a boundary. So the five animals, I think, are in balance. The other reason I think there are five is because those are the five that are the most general. As you get more specific, it starts to just become much more specific to what those other animals are in terms of appropriateness. Monkey is a good style, or a good example of that. So, that Jesse Enkamp video, the guy explains monkey was the war animal. So we're not at war all of the time in our day-to-day lives as of now. So, so you don't need that energy. It's fun to explore as a niche topic, but it's not going to yield the most return on investment as it would studying tiger, crane, leopard, and snake. So that's why I think there are five to kind of start with. But yeah, there are other branch animals. There's all sorts of niche styles you can find. But the reason they are niche is because they just apply a little less often than the others.
Mm. You had mentioned something, and it stuck in my head when you were saying, why don't people who train in these styles, why aren't they effective in a fight? Is something to that extent? Can you repeat that?
Yeah, just a criticism of quote unquote kung fu. Well, if it was effective, why don't you see it in MMA a whole lot? That's just a common narrative that comes across martial arts.
So, yeah, this is there's a very specific reason for this. All right, in my opinion, and that's that people who train in these more internal martial arts usually have a very specific mindset. And that mindset is they have no intention to fight consensually.
Right.
However, if you were going to use it in combat, you would have to train it for one-on-one combat.
Yeah.
And I think that's what, so you don't see it a lot because you don't have people willing to do that. So normally, like for me, I actually, I do like, a little hard sparring.
Yeah.
I think it's good for you. But at the same time, like, do I have any desire to get into an MMA ring? Probably not.
Right.
But if I was going to do that, I would take my martial art and I would have to start applying it in an octagon.
Yeah.
I would have to start, doing some very hard sparring, and some drilling for those situations. Because they're not just gonna, you can't just learn a bunch of moves and hope it's gonna come out in a different situation. You have to train the situation, and understand that things are different, in MMA. You do have gloves, which people will say all the time, if you can do it with gloves, you can do it without gloves. Not necessarily.
Yeah.
There are some nuance there. I do agree that that's probably the best test of your martial arts. If you wanted to know 100% how effective it is, being one-on-one in a ring, that is probably the best way to do it. Because otherwise, we learn things that are devastating. If we test them out in real speed and killed our opponent, we're going to jail.
Right.
So, but I think if you took a style of Kung Fu and applied it to the ring and drilled it for MMA, I think it'd be very effective. So that was my little spiel on that.
Yeah. Again, I don't necessarily agree with the narrative, and that is the narrative, and it's good to be aware of because it comes up in conversation. I've had people ask, like, signing up their kid, does this work? And so all I have are testimonials from the times it did work, which most of the time it does. And again, most of the time it's not in an MMA ring.
No.
Most of the time, like the most famous, like the best example I can think of from one of my students, like I trained this kid their entire short martial arts journey, was I just taught them the 8 blocks, and they were at school one day, and they made a joke to their friend, and another kid with an anger issue thought that they were making fun of him, but they weren't. So he took a swing, and the other kid just did a 2 block. The first kid's arm got hurt, and it stopped.
Yeah.
So, and that's kind of like, especially for kids who are mostly who we teach, that's kind of all you need. Like, it's we're not advertising that, if it's one of these movie scenarios, like you can be an action star and just take out like 8 trained people or something like that. It's sometimes the fastest way to de-escalate a situation is having the tools to escalate it faster than the other person. So it's not super great,
No.
But again, the other person has some choices too. So as long as you can protect yourself, that's pretty much all we can ask for.
Yeah.
And that's all we're saying that we do, is we just train a set of moves to, like you said, fit a specific situation. The one-on-one, like, octagon is a situation, like you said, I think it's the best way to test your martial arts against another trained opponent.
Yes.
I also think that there are certain assumptions you're making in an octagon that you just wouldn't make in reality, especially the way Fred Villari would talk about it, where it's like, this is going to save your life. That means your life is a threat. That means you don't have gloves, you don't have mats, you have an environment. Can't do that, and you can't bash someone's head into a wall in MMA. So there are certain things that it's just, there are so many more variables in reality.
It's completely different.
Yeah. So, and again, an MMA person could do that too. I'm not saying they can't.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just saying that some martial arts that wouldn't be effective in the specific realm of MMA might be effective when you have more variables that you can leverage.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's all what you train for. And those MMA guys, I think we talked about this on a podcast already, so I don't want to double down on it. But
yeah,
they spend every day, numbing the nerve endings in their legs.
Yeah.
They're just a different breed of human, and the chances of you getting attacked by an MMA fighter on the street, it's not realistic. And then it's the same thing as when you're sparring with someone who's competent versus someone who's never sparred before.
Right.
And all of a sudden you're getting tripped up a little bit.
Yeah.
Just because it is so unconventional what they're doing.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of times that's what we're training for. That really unconventional, just haphazard, because it does throw you off. In Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it's the same way. You get a white belt that has no idea what they're doing, and all of a sudden they're just like winging their body around in crazy ways, and you're like, "What are you doing?"
Yeah, yeah.
And you can you manage it. That's why you train. But at the same time, it does throw you a little bit. So I think there's a difference, and there's been times in MMA where you've seen people come from different styles that you wouldn't typically think fit MMA, but they trained it from MMA, and it throws people. There was a dude that was doing capoeira, and it wasn't he adjusted it to be more MMA friendly, but it threw people off.
Yeah.
And then people like Machida and Wonderboy, sorry, almost said Superboy.
Yeah.
And Stephen Wonderboy Thompson, who do traditional karate, and just how they move through people so much. Machida knocked someone out with a front kick to the face.
Yeah.
And then you have Wonderboy who fights from a side stance, fights from like a side horse stance.
Yeah.
And is constantly checking people's legs with side kicks, and just throws them off because we've come to a place where we assume that there is one way to do MMA.
Right.
And there's not. That being said, like I said, I like half speed, MMA sparring and stuff just to, kind of test yourself. I don't think I'd ever want to get in an MMA ring. I like my brain cells too much.
Yeah, yeah. I agree. Just on the practicality front, Master Stephanie sent me this, but it was just a guide. And he's just saying, if you look at the statistics, purely statistical, 1% of the world, maybe, has trained any martial arts. Way less than 1% has gotten any good at it. So if you're thinking about defending yourself against someone, just purely statistically, probably not someone with a lot of training. So so take with that what you will. So the big question, and I think this is where we're going to spend most of our time, is can we explain the 5 animals and how they pertain to life? And I think it's kind of going through them one at a time. So I think where I want to start is with crane. That's what I was always trained in, was start with crane, both martial arts wise and in life, because crane is the point of balance, and kind of like the neutral position of a transmission, you can kind of shift into the others situationally. So crane, how would you describe crane?
I wish I could say that crane was my best animal. It's definitely not. So for me, crane is quite an observer. It's a very observant animal, and it allows, in most cases, someone to make their own mistakes. So, even in class, from a teaching standpoint, if I'm being crane, I'm kind of letting someone, maybe step out and recognize what they're doing wrong, as opposed to jumping in and fixing it for them.
Yeah.
Being more subtle, and just positioning things to make more sense. So we always end up relating it to teaching, so not as much to normal everyday life, but even in everyday life, crane. If I was in an office setting and someone next to me was saying something that was really bothering me. Now, I don't get bothered by much, and I think that's a martial arts trait, is you just let things kind of run off you. But let's just say I was, kind of getting bothered by something he was saying. If I was being crane instead of engaging, I would probably just see if there was any way my cubicle could be moved, perhaps, or, maybe just trying to engage in a conversation with that individual that did not involve the topic that was bothering me.
Yeah.
So instead of instead of confronting the problem head on. That would be, like I said, not my best animal, but...
Yeah, I'm going to disagree with you on something, which
perfect.
is about teaching. One of the life-changing quotes I heard is that you're always teaching. Everybody's always teaching all the time.
Oh. Okay.
Which is why it's such a helpful skill set. So, when you walk into the store, or how you talk to the cashier, or even the clothes you decide to wear, you're teaching about something about yourself. Sometimes the lesson isn't what you intend, but you are teaching. And I think that's, if I've learned anything over the past 5 years, it's about what you're unintentionally teaching and just paying attention to that. I think is probably one of the most powerful lessons, while also recognizing that the person on the receiving end, the learner, also has the responsibility to be the guardian of their own mind and be able to take what they want out of it. Mm-hmm. But yeah, in terms of like your description of Crane, I think that it's pretty spot on. The 3 words I was trained to with Crane are balance, grace, and patience. And from a body perspective, it's all about figuring out how to bring things into alignment so that it's all working properly. Mm-hmm. A lot of times when we experience pain or discomfort, something is overworking because something is underworking. So it's figuring out how to relieve pressure from the thing overworking by figuring out what's underworking and make sure it's doing its job, like a group project. Mm-hmm. So your example of the cubicles, awesome. I think that the other real life thing is just learning how to listen and ask strong questions. Because sometimes if somebody's upset about something, they're really upset about something else. So just figuring out how to kind of pull back and see the bigger picture would be the life lesson application of it, which is really hard. In our culture, we tend to praise effort and trying harder. So a lot of times if something is wrong, societally, our instinct is to find a solution, and there must be something we're doing wrong rather than paying attention to the design of something. Mm-hmm. So for a teaching example, we used to teach 3 and 4-year-olds. We no longer do this. But years ago, we had a different dojo space, bright white walls, bright blue mats, lots of colorful equipment. What would happen, it was also like an 8 a.m. 3 and 4-year-old class. It was awful. But the parents would let the kids start by running into the dojo and playing with the equipment. So if we weren't there way before them, we'd be starting off just trying to corral them instead of doing a class. So from a Crane perspective, one of the things we did was we learned the night before to just remove all that equipment from the room. So instead of like trying to overpower the kids and their parents, we just removed the distraction. So that would be an example of a Crane way of approaching like a problem. Not always the best way. Like I've definitely seen some times where, you try to let it sit and sort itself out, but if it's an illness, sometimes it gets worse. Sometimes you need an antibiotic. So
sounds like we're going into Snake.
Well, yeah. Or sometimes it's having the harder conversation, which I think will segue us into Tiger.
So yeah, Tiger's an interesting one. So body wise, I'm not a tiger, obviously. I'm very I'm pretty small for a dude. I don't have a large amounts of overwhelming force, so I don't gravitate towards tiger. I don't typically feel like I can overpower someone unless I'm teaching a child.
Yeah.
In which case I'm typically not fighting a child anyways.
Yeah. One would hope.
Yeah, you never know. But at least as far as the compassion part of Tiger is concerned, I feel like I do connect with that. I really try and care, especially these days. Maybe not in my younger years, but I really care for the people that I interact with on a daily basis, and especially if there's something if there is any conflict, I try and approach it from a place of compassion, which would definitely be a very Tiger um, energy. In class, same thing. If I have to talk to a student, I come from a place of compassion. I want them to know that even though, let's say there was a behavior that's, not ideal, I want them to know that I care about them, and that's why I'm trying to correct this. This is coming from a place where, I always try and frame things instead of saying, like, we don't do that, or you're acting bad, or I always try and take out that language, and I always try and I always trying to say, like, I was like, you're such a good kid, and good kids don't do this. So I want them to know that I see their potential, and I see what's who they are, and who they are is not a bad kid. Who they are is a good kid that's just currently making a bad decision.
Yeah.
So as far as Tiger goes, that's where I am. But that's probably the only part of Tiger I typically reflect.
I think that you do more than you give yourself credit for. One of the things I've learned about Tiger is its energy output, and our entire instructor team, because you teach with us on Fridays, have commented on the fact that you can really energize a class, which is a Tiger trait. So it's you are also correct on the compassion side, but I think that in terms of just energy, you have a lot more than you give yourself credit for. We tend to definitely fall more, like our school falls more on the yin side of things. Sometimes it gets mistaken for a lack of energy, but it just tends to be kind of like this focus and internal resilience. Probably reflects, our leadership. Our students reflect their leadership, but we tend to be a little bit more chill and a little less like, so it's refreshing when, you come in and you're doing fitness with them and you're racing the kids and stuff, because you have an energy output that we just lack. We can develop it, and it's something we're aware of developing, but right now it is a gap that you're able to address. So the mantra that I was trained with Tiger, not sure if I'm supposed to share this, but is ready, steady, clear, strong, willing, able. So that kind of is like the mindset. Ready, steady, clear, so you don't have to mull it over. You're ready to take action, and you're clear on what that action is. And then strong, willing, able is, you just get in there and get it done. So from the action perspective, you take a lot more action than many martial artists I've met. And I think the key thing is just the clarity. A lot of times I was trained to go back to crane when things are unclear. So you kind of like again, see the bigger picture to see if you can find clarity. Once you have that clarity, it's about not holding back too long. It's about learning how to take action. So in terms of, let's go back to the cubicle example. You have someone saying something that's bothering you. It's about figuring out the right action. So it could be that person, they don't know that they're bothering people, So, having just a heart-to-heart conversation, if you're in that position, would make a lot of sense. Or it could be, unfortunately going to HR or talking to your manager, or there are all sorts of ways to take action, some of which are a little more direct than others. But it's, again, coming from that place of compassion. It would if the action is reflective of your want for this employee that's bothering you to succeed, I feel like that's more toward the Tiger end. If it's more recognizing that they need to be removed, that would be more on the snake end, which sometimes that is the most compassionate thing. Because if you have, say a toxic team member, the only way for the team to succeed is to remove the toxic element. I really don't like using that language. It is unfortunately accurate some of the time, even though that term I feel gets overused.
It's because of your toxic masculinity.
Oh yes, what I am known for. So Crane is more about the listening side, Tiger is more about the action side, and they complement each other. So usually if we have a team member or a student whose center of gravity is more toward Tiger, we'll train them in some Crane skills just to balance it out. Because, like I said, with Crane, you can get kind of caught in indecision and inaction. With Tiger, sometimes you take action too quickly and there are all these secondary, tertiary consequences that really could have been avoided if you had just waited a sec. I don't know if you've experienced that, but another quality of Tiger is having the strength to make mistakes. So you have these two extremes, and floating in the middle, a little more forward and back, would be the leopard. Also a big cat, but not as big as a tiger.
That is where I spend the majority of my time.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm a leopard at heart. It's what used to get me in trouble. And because I was good at wording things in a way where I can get people to agree to things that they didn't necessarily want to do.
Yeah.
So, and it's why I was always good at corralling people to, do things, crazy things, like take an impromptu trip somewhere. They may necessarily, not necessarily wanted to do that, but I worded it in a way where they thought they did. And I've always been pretty good at bringing that kind of not deceptive, but kind of deceptive energy, but and it's just, I feel like leopard's one of those things that, it's so easy to use it poorly, but it's so effective to use well, and in the classroom, being able to, teach things, and in the kids' minds, they're playing a game, but you're teaching a principle,
right?
And there's leopard right now. You're hiding the fact that they're actually learning something important.
Yeah. I think the word I've been coming back to more recently, rather than deception, is just concealment. Because deception is a little more sinister. Concealment is like you're just not showing your full hand right away. And there is a reason why in stories and in media, trickster characters are fun to watch, because there's an enjoyment to watching how they work. And like you said, and I actually wonder if the reason you recognize the shadow elements of a leopard are because your center of gravity is closer to them, so you just it's faster to recognize it because it's one that you identify with a little more naturally. When we live one of the animals a little more prominently than the others, the shadow side tends to creep in, which is why when you recognize animals that would help complement it, you're able to appreciate the benefits of it. I can't remember where I heard it, but someone said that most people's character flaws are just a strength that's out of balance.
I'd like to hope that the shadow side of that, I like that you used that terminology.
Oh yeah, it's something Ken has talked about before, and all it means is that you went a little too far into the shade on one side, so you just need to bring it back to the light with the others.
Yeah, and I think that's the hard part about growing up, gravitating towards one specific way, and I think everyone does it, even people who are naturally crane, growing up. Sometimes if I would assume that shadow element for a crane would be completely being withdrawn, and so there's always that hard part to manage, those natural personality types, and I was a chaotic youngster. We're not talking about monkey, and even though I don't know how to do monkey physically, I think I had a lot of that chaos energy in me when I was younger. So mixed with the leopard, it was I was destined to cause destruction in my wake, until I kind of grew up a little bit and figured out how to be more responsible.
Yeah, well, and just as another segue into the fourth one, I find that when we talk about the shadow side, it's remedied by the opposite animal, which also brings us back to why there are five, is because they remedy each other. So, like Crane, like you said, the shadow side tends to be withdrawn and inaction. You're so far above the clouds, it's hard to recognize the people on the ground. So the way to remedy that is with Tiger, by taking more action. And the opposite is true. If you're taking so much action without understanding, well, now you need to pull back a little bit in order to see the bigger picture, so that way you take the right action instead of just action. So with Leopard, the benefit is the innovation, it's the creativity. The flip side of that one is Snake. So you've described Snake a little bit at the beginning. Is that one that you're kind of interested in right now?
Super interested. Yeah.
Which would be interesting because you were mentioning you tend toward Leopard, so it would make sense that you'd be drawn to the remedy animal.
Mm-hmm. I was teaching an adult yesterday, and he had mentioned he was interested in Snake, and so we just kind of, played around with the Snake techniques he already knew, and I was kind of injecting, more of what they mean, why, how you can actually make these random movements more Snake, and it's been resonating with me a lot lately, because that's always been really difficult for me. Actually, it was a really Snake day yesterday, because I had to do something I have never done in my entire martial arts career, is I had to remove a child from the class.
Mm-hmm.
I have never had to do that. It was the absolute worst. But the child was, not only not listening and being defiant and swinging his belt around.
Yeah.
But not only could I not get control of the child, but then he started shoving other students, and it was getting to the point where it was becoming dangerous.
Yep.
So I had to go Snake and say, nope, we're done. And remove him and bring him to his father and let his father know. And his father, apologized, which was, always refreshing when a parent understands.
Yep.
But it was horrific, but it was necessary, because the second the child was out, I felt like the entire class sighed a breath of relief.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, it was such a better environment for learning, and I got to release the Snake after that.
Yeah.
But it's something I've always had trouble with, because I'm a pretty compassionate person, and I could be a very emotional person.
Mm-hmm.
So turning off the emotions and saying, this needs to happen, is difficult for me. So I think that's why I've been gravitating towards it on the energetic side. And then I just, being so into grappling, I really like that Snake portion of it too, and even the Snake striking is just so cool.
Yeah, well, as the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to me is from a mechanical perspective, just seems so close to Snake, especially when you're on the ground. Oh, yeah. We haven't done a lot in the air. There's definitely some of the other animals like Crane, and we've even seen some Leopard stuff from the upright stuff, but especially on the ground, it's that's all Snake principles trying to figure out. So yeah,
every other animal needs to root for the most part.
Yep.
It needs to draw its power from somewhere, and even though there are instances where you can plant a foot when you're on your back and press up your hips to deliver a kick, or when you're on your side and you're almost rooting with your arm, just like in 30 combination. So there are ways you can kind of root, but for the most part, you don't have root on the ground.
Right.
So everything is internal, which is Snake. I mean, it's the most internal of the four. Before not including Dragon, but
so for Snake, the core skill, I think, in general, this applies to martial arts and out of life, is non-judgmental analysis. So it's looking at the data and being able to remove your excuses and justifications for it, and just look at what the data is telling you, being able to analyze it, which informs your understanding, action, and innovation. Which is why I think the path to dragon requires moving through snake first. And what's interesting is with snake, it doesn't lack emotion. It's just that the emotions are a data point. So if you have this feeling of dread of removing a student, it's a data point that reflects the fact that you care about that student's progression. And if you have to make the decision to remove a student, it's motivated not by wanting to remove the student, it's motivated by your compassion to help the other 10, 20 students that are in the room that this student is preventing from having the best experience. Now, that can't happen all of the time. The nice thing about having a team of instructors is if you have that one student, you can just send that one person to go deal with them or remove them or distract them or whatever you need to do or teach them. But if you don't have that, you just got to do what you got to do. But yeah, it's that non-judgmental analysis, which then informs your innovation and your creativity. So the fifth animal, because Lately touched on it, is dragon. So.
Oh boy, yeah, dragon. Okay.
Yeah, I'll let you know once I figure it out.
Yeah, that's where most of us are. Ken once, or probably more than once, but I remember him saying that Master Fritz used to say that dragon is not a destination. So you're always aspiring to be the dragon, which is, just having complete control over a situation to the point where there's always a win-win, in any sort of exchange. So, and that's kind of, as far as how to move like the dragon, that's beyond me. But whip-like motions, I know that, but that is something I'm far from. But yeah, on a, every now and then you find yourself in a position where you're the dragon. And typically with me, I feel sometimes like the dragon in situations like this. When someone asks me about something with history, the history of the art, something I dive into enough where if I'm asked, I feel like all of a sudden I'm the dragon.
Right.
It's just there. I don't have to think about the knowledge. And there's a couple sides to this, though. Sometimes, because I do enough research, I have a tend to repeat things, and sometimes give a little bit more information than someone asks for, which would not be the dragon, So, but there's times when I have just the absolute perfect conversation.
Yeah.
And I feel confident in the information I gave the person I was talking to. It was just the perfect amount of time. It was the right response. They felt like they got a lot out of it, and that was the dragon. And that's one of the few places where I feel like the dragon. But yeah.
Yeah, it is something you feel, which complicates things because, again, to speak to American culture, we tend to want to intellectualize a lot of things. And even though there is an intellectual element, when you're in the dragon, so often you don't recognize that you're in it because you're just in it. So to digress for a second, there's a positive psychologist named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. I had to practice how to pronounce that over and over again. And it was a name I came across when researching game design. And the reason I bring him up is he's the one that kind of came up with the idea of a flow state. And flow state, with his definition, is basically like a 2-axis graph. Along one axis is time and skill, and along the other axis is challenge. So, the metaphor we would use is the drawing silk. So right tension. So when there's the right amount of challenge or the right amount of skill, you just start to feel this flow where there's not it's a lack of obstruction and you're just kind of in it and enjoying it. So if you think about like a video game, if the game is way too hard, way too quickly, most people will get frustrated and quit. But if it's too easy for too long, most people will get bored of it and they'll stop playing. So it's finding that right tension, which is different for everyone. Someone who likes playing Dark Souls, they love a challenging experience. I don't. Some people will take a look at like some RPGs and they'll be like, it's too easy. You just do this combination of equipment and it feels like you win automatically every time. For me, I kind of enjoy the flow of just kind of leveling and grinding a little bit. I've been playing Final Fantasy IX again. I enjoy the little level up thing and just kind of playing Chocobo hot and cold. It's not difficult, but it is. It does help get me into kind of a flow state. So I think that's similar to what you're describing, which is, conversationally about martial arts history, you don't have to worry. You're liberated and you can just kind of go.
Yeah, and it like I said, you only feel it's always afterwards that you notice it, at least for me.
Yeah.
And because, sometimes I if you've ever spoken with me, you know that I'm very long-winded. And I can talk for a lot.
Why use 5 words when 500 will do?
Exactly. And sometimes I'm talking at people, and it's those beautiful moments where it's just a genuine, good conversation where I not only, have the information that the person's looking for, but we're both getting something out of it. I feel like that it's a beautiful moment. And that's where I...
Well, and I think you also touched on, because all the animals have a shadow side. So, like, even dragon, someone who gets to be such an expert in their craft, and we've had these conversations, I don't know if on the podcast, but at least privately, about Fred Villari. You get to be so good, and you get to be so clear that it's frustrating that other people aren't seeing what you're seeing right away. So, sometimes it seemed like Fred Villari would just go off on something chaotically, but it was because he was seeing something that nobody else was. So it seemed disconnected, but to him, it all made sense. And so the shadow side is that detachment, which can be very lonely, and also create arrogance, where you know better than everybody else and they should shut up and listen to you because you're the expert, forgetting the fact that, part of the magic of being an expert is having that flow with somebody else. Yeah. What I've been personally toying with, knowing that there's this idea of, shadow sides and remedies and how the animals match, is actually how the dragon relates to the monkey. Because in the Chinese zodiac, the monkey, which is the trickster, is the only one that's really able to confound the dragon. And so as a remedy, monkey, like I said earlier, the style is the fact that it is detached from any outcome. It's willing to experiment freely, but without the discernment you get with a leopard. So, for example, if you're teaching a kid and you disguise a principle as a game, they're playing the game, but you're just thinking of the principle. With monkey, you're just playing the game. Like, there's not, like, you're not thinking about all the things like, oh, what's their energy level and all. You're just playing the game, which is where the caterpillar game came from. I just want to bash some kids with a blocker.
I think back, 20 years ago when me and Sean used to play Penguin Slide Ninja with the kids.
Yeah.
And we were hitting their feet so hard that they were doing, like, side flips.
Yeah.
I think that was a lot of that.
Well, yeah, so...
chaos monkey energy.
And there is a place for that. Sometimes it's good to just, let loose and just play for the sake of playing. Of course, it's so much easier to get into the shadow side, which is like, you're dipping too far, it's hard to stop. Monkey can dip into cruelty or a lack of compassion because you're willing to deprecate everybody else for the sake of the joke, which is where dragon kind of remedies it by having this higher purpose. That's also enjoyable. Like dragon unless you're on the receiving end from a fighting perspective, shouldn't feel like it's confrontational, right? Or feel like you're getting attacked. It's direct, but not in a mean way. Which when you're good at Tiger, it's not either. But like my point being that they do remedy each other, because sometimes when you're in that lonely place of the dragon, one of the best remedies is just a human connection. And monkeys, I think, are a lot closer to humans than any of the other animals. So that's an idea I've been playing with, is just the monkey and the dragon being each other's friends. Dom and Johnny in the morning.